But please feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question at any point in time. Raise your hand, however you want to do it. We also have the option of the chat, which the chat, as I'm speaking, I'm setting it right now to just send questions to me. So if you have a question that you want to ask anonymously, feel free to put it in the chat box, and then I will relay that question to Natalie, or just put the question out to the group to talk about. If we get more questions, then we're able to get through in an hour and a half, which based on last week's conversation might very well be the case. Just know that one of the 5 of us who are helping organize this will follow up with you individually. So we're not gonna, we want all questions. We want as many as we can get. Not that we are experts in anything in particular, but we just wanna make sure that we're keeping a dialogue going, because that's the most essential piece here, is to keep the dialogue going. Also, just to let you know, I'm recording this conversation so that the recording will be available later on. You're welcome to share that with other people if you want to. And also, the video option is just that, it's optional. So you can choose to have your video on or not. It makes no difference to us, whatever's comfortable for you or whatever works best with your internet's bandwidth. So it's totally up to you. Lastly, I just want to give some framing to this conversation, that this is a space that is welcoming of all people, of all opinions, of all questions, of all concerns. And we want to make sure that as we enter into this space together, that we're entering it with the mindset of being ready to listen, being ready to learn from each other, and being always conscious of communicating respectfully. And so those are the basic ground rules that we'll stick with. Yeah, again, if you have any other questions and you want to ask them to me privately, I will share them with the group anonymously. So feel free to get the conversation going that way. But I will start by, let's see, I think I know everybody on this call, but I'll introduce myself and then I'll hand it off to Natalie, who will help get everybody else introduced. So I'm Jane Samuels. I work in the athletics department, Associate Athletic Director in SWA. I'm white, as you can probably see, 50 years old. And so I come to this conversation with an understanding that my own upbringing and my own, just plain being steeped in the American culture that I've grown up with, I have come to this conversation in the last couple of years really trying to be aware of my own biases and trying to be aware of just knowing that if this is the environment I've grown up in, a lot of these messages are internalized, whether or not I'm conscious of them or not. So that's what I try and bring every time I come into a conversation about race, is just looking at my own understanding and questioning how valid that is, and then learning from others to be better informed. So that's me. Natalie, I'll let you go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane. Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us today. My name is Natalie. I'm originally from the Cherokee Indian Reservation in the little corner of North Carolina. And I, growing up there, didn't know how different it was, because that's all I knew. And it definitely is a different situation than a lot of people experience. But I had a really great tribe support. They supported me throughout my higher ed. And so I ended up going to the University of Tennessee for my undergrad, go Vols. And then I went to UCF for my master's in Central Florida down in Orlando, and then went back to do my PhD at Tennessee. In between there, I made it out to the West Coast to work at Nike and Wieden and Kennedy, and just, yeah, lucky with some great experiences and wanted to get back into the education space. And as I've gotten older and learned more issues of diversity, equity, you know, for all people from all different backgrounds has been really important to me, and something that I want to advocate for and encourage conversation around. And so before we dive in, I also wanted to have Coach Gibbs and Coach Willis give a little bit about themselves.
And Coach Heyer, whenever he gets.
Yes,
he's now with us.
Coach Heyer. He made it. Yay.
Coach Willis, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Coach John Willis. I am from beautiful Jacksonville, Florida. I am a proud graduate of the University of South Florida, arch rivals to UCF.
Bulls.
That's why I gave that thumbs down there. But anyway, I'm black male, living in St. Paul, Oregon. My wife is white. I have two biracial sons. And I grew up in the South, actually moved to Oregon about 6 years ago. I've had a privilege to live in Florida, Missouri, Oregon, and a brief stint in Oklahoma. So that's where I've lived and seen, and I spent some time in Buffalo, New York also. And so those are the places that I've lived, and I'm here to continue the conversation. Looking forward to it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Coach Kibbs. I coach the women's lacrosse team at Linfield. I grew up in Kentucky and I have family in Georgia, so spent some time down there. And I think, you know, coaching women's lacrosse, we are probably one of the most undiverse sports that you could have. And it's one issue that, you know, I'm trying to better understand. I want to be proactive. I definitely grew up with a kind of Southern mentality as well, with my, you know, grandparents, parents in that way. And, you know, every day I'm trying to understand a different perspective. And as a leader, I want to help my team also understand different perspectives. And so, you know, I'm here to help and be proactive, and also fall on my face sometimes and hopefully learn from that and move on. So.
Awesome. Doug, Coach Heyer.
All right. Sorry for the delay, little computer technical difficulties. So I'm Doug Heyer. I had a recent change in my position here at Linfield just in February, March. I coached football for 20 years here, and I'm currently now the senior associate athletic director here at Linfield. And that kind of changed. So I'm no longer coaching football, but really enjoyed the 20 years of coaching football, and it's starting to sink in a little bit, not being able to coach, but I'm sure that's going to come into play as my role changes, but I'm still going to be able to be around kids and continue to work with great people, which is important to me. I'm a Linfield graduate. I graduated here in 1987. I grew up in Pearl City, Hawaii. Graduated from obviously a school in Hawaii in high school. My dad is from Missouri, and he met my mom on Waikiki Beach. My mom's family just moved from Whangaʻalu, Samoa. So I am of Samoan and Tongan descent. I just found out recently that I had Tongan Polynesian blood after my son insisted that I do a DNA test. So I did that, and so I'm about 40% Polynesian, and you know, and I came to Linfield. I coached high school for 10 years and came to Linfield in 2000. So I'm extremely grateful to be part of this and super excited to share. And as they say in Hawaii, talk story. It is Aloha Friday, so we wear our aloha shirts to express and they celebrate Fridays, no work till Monday, you know, that kind of attitude, and enjoying ourselves the last Friday and enjoying the weekend. So thanks for having me.
We need to implement the Hawaiian shirts on Fridays for the whole department. I feel like
Love
we
it.
all should do that. We should
Yeah.
all do that. No, thanks.
Smile on your
Thanks.
face.
I'm
Thanks.
going to share the PowerPoint now, and is that good?
Great.
Nellie?
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, thanks, Coach. And I failed to mention that I started at Linfield back in August as the sport management professor in the school of business, or the soon-to-be school of business. And I also just recently got appointed to be the faculty athletic rep. And so basically being the liaison between athletics and academics. And so if anyone ever wants to talk about anything related to academics, athletics, sports, Linfield, please let me know. But kind of wanted to give an intro of John, Coach Willis, Coach Gibbs, Coach Heyer, and Jane. We've worked really closely these past couple of weeks. I think talking almost daily about what we want to talk about and things that are happening kind of in our world right now. And we had a little slide here of the things that have happened in the past 2 weeks. And I mean, you blink and you can really miss a lot that's going on. You have everything from, you know, racial equality stuff to trans rights, and, you know, even, and then on the sports side, you had this week NASCAR banning Confederate flag. This is all brought up the Kaepernick protests that were over 4 years ago now, which is kind of wild to think about. And, you know, George Floyd's been kind of a headliner, I feel like, but it's also been a call for Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her home after a botched search warrant. Back in the sports world, Drew Brees, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the whole NFL and everything that's been going on there. But again, I really encourage you all. I don't like to really say safe space, because I feel like that should be a given, but I want to make it an inclusive and open space where we can all feel free to share. So feel free to interrupt me if something, the passion kind of hits you and you have a thought or question. But another thing that I think we'll talk about too today is the police defunding call, because that was one that I didn't really understand when I first saw it. So we can come back to that. Just really quickly touch back on terminology. We talked about this a little bit last week, but I want to emphasize that when we talk about white privilege, we're not saying that because of you haven't had a hard life if you're white. We're just saying that white privilege is that you haven't had it hard in your life because you're white. Everyone else who's non-white is usually facing some sort of racism, sexism. There's all these different things that come along with privilege. And so the term white privilege doesn't mean to be demeaning in that form, but it is something that definitely we have to consider in our environment, and especially with our demographic at Linfield. I feel like it is majority white and Caucasian, so something to think about there. I'm not going to go over any of these too much more in depth, but we can definitely come back to it, because especially the performative allyship. I actually heard a really interesting webinar last night talking about, someone called it slacktivism. So not activism, but slacktivism, where you're going out and, you know, maybe getting the Instagram post or getting the tweet out, but you're not really you're not doing it for maybe the right reasons. You're just kind of performing and wanting to maybe upkeep a status quo. So I love this, and Coach Hired sent something similar to, we had talked about something similar about the terminology around equality and equity. So Jane, if you don't mind, the little cartoon I think should be next, our next graphic. Oh, I moved it around on the one online. Sorry, it's like at the very end, I think. But yeah, I think it's like 22, 21. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. And I saw this, so it's the giving tree, but I thought this was a really great representation of the different terminology we use around equality and equity. Inequality being unequal access to opportunities. I think the opportunity piece is so huge in this, and what a lot of people don't realize is your privilege often comes with opportunity, and some people may not ever even have that. And then equality is the question mark being, you know, evenly distributed tools and assistance, but that still might not actually serve everyone in the best way. And then equity, where you're customizing your tools to identify and address inequality. But then finally, with justice, fixing the system to really cater to everyone, and to kind of react to not only each individual, but the environment in which they live in. So I really enjoyed that and thought that was something kind of a fun representation of that. So I'm going to go over really quickly kind of the NFL, what's going on in the NFL, because I think it's a great kind of case study of our society right now. And then I'll pass it over to Coach Willis or Coach Gibbs or Coach Hire to discuss another one of our topics here. So I think, is that where yeah, let's go. Is this the first one? I think it is, right? Yeah. So So I apologize for the graphic image, but this is a meme that I can't really get out of my head since I've seen it. And for people who didn't, and I encourage, if you don't know much about the Colin Kaepernick protest, to check that out, because originally he was sitting in protest to the anthem, and people didn't even notice it, honestly, at first, because it was during preseason. But then he spoke with a veteran from our military, can't remember which branch off the top of my head, but and the veteran actually encouraged him to kneel instead of sitting, and so that's why he kind of modified his protest, and all to bring attention to violence against people of color, and especially African Americans, by the police and by the system. You'll hear me probably say systemic and systematic a lot, because that's a big part of these issues, is the systems and the power that's involved. And so last Friday, we had the NFL actually come out with this statement condemning racism, but there's a really it was a crazy week leading up to that. So if you want to go to the next slide for me, Jane. Before that statement came out, what was kind of wild was, earlier, I think it was the Sunday prior to that, they'd kind of released a kind of what I would like to call a milquetoast statement, one of the more generic "we stand against racism" statements. And our guy up here on the left, I believe his name is Jordan, he was working for the NFL social team, and they were all really frustrated because they were expected to still be tweeting about, so-and-so's best highlights, or best receptions, or best interceptions. And he kind of had it in his head to go directly to the players and say, hey, I want to create something by you, for you, to kind of really get these issues out there. And so that's what ended up being posted by Michael Thomas and several other players. I believe that was on Thursday night. And he did this all rogue on his own, and really thought he might lose his job over it, but he really was adamantly opposed to not saying anything or empowering the players to say anything. And players were making their own personal statements, but it wasn't all condensed into the way that he did it for several of the top players in the league. And you have the discussion of race and injustice happening, but again, the video was kind of the one that really caused some shockwaves. And then if you want to go to the next one for me, Jane, quickly. And then you see teams making statements, and also apologizing for statements, and trying to say that there wasn't, maybe there wasn't racism, or there wasn't things happening, that really was a lot of noise out there. And so that statement was that video was really what led to Roger Goodell making that video, and actually going after, saying his disapproval for racism, and actually acknowledging that the league was built on African American players. And we can go on to the next one, Jane. And I thought this was an interesting one too, actually, I think she's a softball player. And I felt this was really brave of her to say, she took time to learn about what was actually happening, and that it wasn't about the flag, and it was more about the system that had been unfair to people of color. And then the flag discussion also continued when Drew Brees was on I think it was a Yahoo Finance show. It was last Wednesday morning, and he he made I can't remember the exact statement, but he kind of denounced the statements, or he when he was asked if he would kneel, and he said no, that he wouldn't disrespect the flag. And he kind of made the suggestion that he didn't understand what the protest was all about in the first place. And so a lot of people came after him really quick, and in less than 24 hours, he issued an apology. Jane, if we can get that going here. So this was the first tweet when he said, "I will never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag." And you have people like LeBron James coming out and saying, you're not understanding even understanding why Cap was kneeling in the first place. And it's, you know, it's been over 4 years now. And then the apology that next day, like I said, under 24 hours, he comes back with an apology. Later, President Trump tweets that he kind of sided with Breeze and saying that, you know, you should respect the flag. And we can keep, yeah. So these are the posts that Breeze made in his apology. And what I thought was kind of the turning point for Breeze to me was when he actually came back and not only did the apology, but then came back and actually disputed President Trump about, okay, I learned what this was really about. And it's not about the flag. It's about the issues of systemic racial injustice, economic oppression, police brutality, and judicial and prison reform. And so Drew Brees was like the headliner last week, and in just, you know, 2 days, it kind of completely flipped. And this was all happening in kind of the whirlwind of the NFL, not making a statement, things like that. And I also included a couple tweets here from the just messages from college players, who we don't have time to get into the discussion about paying players in college and all that, but just I thought some really good interesting messaging around college athletics. And Tom Herman, the coach from, I believe he's at, can't remember, Texas, maybe University of Texas. And he made the point of, you know, you can pack a stadium and support African-American coaches, but are you going to let them date your daughter, hire them? And you can't have it both ways, which I thought was really powerful. So just kind of a case study in the kind of football in the United States being one of the biggest sports, and not even sports, but just biggest phenomenon that we have, you know, everywhere from digital fandom all the way through, you know, viewership and ratings, and how this has kind of played out through that, and how I'm not sure this would have happened even a year ago. And a lot of people were really wanting Goodell to apologize directly to Kaepernick. I'm not surprised that didn't happen, but it seemed to come a long way in just a couple of days. So Coach Willis or Coach Gibbs or Hire, you want to take it from here, add a little any commentary?
Sure, I'll jump in. So part of what I was asked to discuss was the banning of the Confederate flag from NASCAR events. So I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville is about an hour, maybe an hour, 15-minute drive from Daytona, and where, you know, the Daytona 500 is. So that's a really big event. It's a ton of people. Just to give you perspective, if you're driving past the Daytona Speedway, you pass 7 street lights along the backstretch of the track. So the track was huge. You know, there's a lot of people there. The Confederate flag is something that we see in the South a lot. And I have some questions as about why, you know, and why people, because I've heard people say, and this is open for discussion, I've heard people say that the flag is our heritage. The flag is our heritage. We're holding on to Southern heritage and the pride that is in it. So I just want to say this: the Confederate States of America, which is what the flag represents, the Confederacy lasted a total of 4 years, period. It started in 1861 and it was done in 1865. I don't think that's a ton of time to be holding on and considering that a heritage. Essentially, most people are in college for longer than the Confederacy lasted. The next thing is in the Constitution, in Article 3, Section 3, the Constitution talks about treason. And it simply says, treason against the United States shall consist only if levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving aid and comfort. Now, the Confederacy levied war against the Union. So I don't understand how a person can be disrespected by Colin Kaepernick kneeling, which fits directly into the First Amendment and the freedom of speech, and say that that is offensive to the flag, but yet and still wave the Confederate flag, because that is absolute treason. So that is something that I don't understand. I noticed also today in NASCAR, there are other drivers, including Jimmy Johnson, who are getting rid of this well-known graphics guy, the guy who paints their helmet. Two other drivers have pulled out from allowing him to paint their helmets simply because of some of his tweets and things that he had made. So I'm opening up for discussion and how you guys feel about the Confederate flag. I saw a graphic. I did not send that to Jane, but I did see a graphic that shows the Nazi flag. And it said that the Nazi flag to Jews is as the Confederate flag is to Black people. So I'm opening up the floor for conversation.
Maybe we should do a quick recap on why the Confederate was formed.
Okay, the Confederate States of America was formed
to
by
protect the southern states.
Correct.
And their crop, right? Agriculture, growing cotton.
Well, it's the way of life. It's the way of life. So the southern, there are 7 southern states that seceded from the Union. Okay, and this was to protect the southern way of life, which really comes down to the economy of the South. And this is the economy of the South. You had raw goods coming from the South. So you take, all of us have on a shirt right now, right? That shirt is made from cotton. Well, that cotton is grown in the South. Okay, so me as a plantation owner, I make money off of the cotton because I don't have to pay for the labor or the people who are picking the cotton. Cotton grows on a bush, okay? So the most effective way to get all of the cotton off the bush is to pick it by hand, okay? And that's just honest with you. So you pick cotton by hand and you put it in a bag, and that bag is then weighed, and then you ship off the bag of cotton. So that cotton is then made into shirts. So anyway, so the idea is I want to keep my plantations so that I can grow my cash crops, cotton, tobacco, rice, those kind of things, and I don't want to pay for the labor. So that is how
you own the labor.
I'm sorry?
Because at that point, you're owning the labor. You're not
Correct.
having to pay anything.
Absolutely. You own the labor. So you got to remember, at that point in time, slaves were thought of as chattel, and that is human property. So you had slaves who worked the fields. Yes, you did. You also had some slaves that were bred. For example, if there was somebody who is somebody who's coming to my mind that you all know is like Austin Hilton, right? Austin Hilton's about 6'5". He weighs about 225 pounds. So if Austin Hilton was a slave, Austin Hilton would have been bred in order to produce more slaves of his size. Does that make sense?
Like livestock.
Exactly. Exactly like livestock. Absolutely like livestock. You know, so those were things that were going on in the Confederacy. And that is not to say that people in the North did not own slaves, okay? Because people in the North did own slaves, all right? I think it's very important that we look at the document that was supposed to end slavery, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? Now, you have to go back and read the Emancipation Proclamation, all right? The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in specific counties. They were all in the South, in heavily slave-ridden areas. So the purpose is, if we free the slaves, then these slaves can no longer fight for the South during the Civil War. So in other words, we're going to pass a law that will cut the South's troops. Does that make sense? So the Emancipation Proclamation was more strategic than anything else as far as a war move. So I just want to make sure that we know that.
And I think all of us from the South, we were kind of taken aback when we moved to the Pacific Northwest and continued to sing the flag, right?
Yes, that was a huge thing for me. I'm like, do you even know where this is coming from? That was mind-boggling to me as well.
I think,
Lindsay,
I was going to say, like, just for some larger context on the symbiology of this, and the symbolism of each of these things, the flag, the American flag, the Confederate flag, the statues that we have up in various places, what the meaning of is of a video from the NFL players. And Gary and I talk about this stuff all the time. Language matters. Everything, the word choice matters, right? And so we as human beings are narrative seeking and narrative creating beings. We look for narrative in things, and we look for something. I don't just look at my laptop as a machine. I look at my laptop as freedom. It allows me to do my work from anywhere I want. It has symbolism to me beyond just its functionality. And so as human beings, that is how we make sense of the world, by looking around and seeing what we see and then adding meaning to those things. And so that's why understanding, like what John just said about the Nazi flag being to Jewish people, what the Confederate flag is to Black people, as we enter this conversation about race, we really have to put ourselves forward and sit with what the symbol means to someone who doesn't look like us. And so really understand how that feels to someone else when they're seeing a Confederate statue or a Confederate flag, and just sit with the threat of that somebody might be feeling if they look differently than you. For me, that's potent because I can relate to the Nazi and Jewish thing. I've got Jewish relatives. I know exactly what fear that instills in me. So it helps me to understand how that narrative for a person of color is so potent and is threatening and is violent. So anyway, so as human beings, I say that just to back up, as all of us have that ability to look for narratives and understand narratives, and use that skill right now to put yourself in someone else's shoes to feel that.
And I don't want to go away from the Confederate conversation, but it is kind of a good segue real quick for white fragility, which, thanks to Coach Simmons, kind of turned us on to this book written by Robin DiAngelo. She coined the term white fragility. And it's ultimately, it's meant to provoke. It's not a solution-based type idea, but it does create a situation for white people to learn to be uncomfortable with what it means to be white, and the defensiveness that white people get when faced with racial issues and racial stress, and the inability to be able to actually tolerate racial stress. And so, a lot of times, like if you find yourself, maybe even recently with everything that's been going on in our country, if you kind of throw your hands up and, you talk about, that you can't handle it, you're not a part of it, you're not adding to the problem, so why does it matter to you? And it's really because you're uncomfortable you're getting defensive about, whiteness being attacked, basically, and not being able to understand like the white construct. And the problem is that racism is a white problem. It was constructed and created by white people. So and Robin says this, it's ultimately our responsibility to help, disentangle that.
We have a question, actually. This is really a conversation piece too. It's a great question, so thanks for bringing it up. It's talking about forms of protest, and thinking about Kaepernick and how he chose to protest, when he chose to protest, the timing of that, during the anthem, should it be before or after the anthem? What are thoughts too about feedback on how and when somebody should protest? So anything along those lines that you guys want to address would be good.
I think what I respect so much about what Kaepernick did was, like, he had his ideal in his head. He was gonna, because the anthem is such a, you know, a visceral thing that connects us to this country. And but he not only he took input from, you know, veterans, when people who were, I had friends who were very, like, they were brought to tears because they thought it was offensive to people in the military, and he wanted to make sure that it wasn't about that, and so he sought out the you know, feedback. And you know, and it's just crazy to see how something for him that, you know, and this is where I think we can also talk to about, like, the media and how media can change your messaging. And it's you know, and then you have Donald Trump saying, you know, calling them SOBs for kneeling. And it's really easy for those messages to get really construed and what the original intent was. And I think for all of us, it's really hard to admit, A, that we're wrong, or B, that we don't know something. And so I think a lot of that, and it takes a lot of courage to educate yourself and become aware of something instead of just taking things at face value. But sorry, I'm rambling, but anyone else want to comment on Kaepernick and forms of protest?
I will comment.
Go ahead.
I just think that the irony between the fact that Kaepernick played in the NFL it's just ironic to me, simply because the NFL is the first major sport that we see this celebration, if you will, of the national anthem. Okay. So I think you have to go back and understand that when the NFL takes money from the Department of Defense to create a platform for patriotism, okay, when the NFL takes a check from the Department of Defense to say, okay, now we're going to make this national anthem a big thing before your games, understand that the NFL was around in the 70s, and in the 70s, they weren't playing the national anthem before games. Does that make sense? So the fact that the NFL is having these flyovers and playing these anthems and having all these people waving flags in the middle of the field, this is all a business move. Okay, it's just like how prior to 2 years ago, NFL players were able to wear pink cleats during the month of October, and as a pro breast cancer awareness campaign during the month of October. Well, there's a guy named D'Angelo Williams who played football for the Carolina Panthers, and his mother actually died in December from breast cancer. Well, he wore pink cleats in December to honor his mother, and he was fined by the NFL for a uniform infraction. So wait a minute, now that's like a change in narrative. So are we really concerned about breast cancer awareness? I think not. I think the NFL is a business. So for Kaepernick to take a knee before a game, I think that is him using his platform. And I think that as long as you are willing to protest peacefully, I don't have a problem with it. My problem with protesting is when it is not done peacefully. I personally have not been out rioting or looting or destroying any property or anything like that. I have not. I will not. That's just because of my own personal beliefs. However, I do understand violence as a response. And the reason I understand violence as a response is because of this. I want you to think of a guy named Christopher Dorner. And I don't know if you know who that guy is or not, but I'm going to tell you a little story today, class. This is what I would say when I taught history class. So Christopher Dorner is a former LAPD officer who was executing a warrant with another female officer who happened to be white. they have the suspect in custody, and this other police officer ended up kicking this suspect. And so Mr. Dorner thought that that was inappropriate. He filed a protest. He filed a complaint, with the department. Fast forward, he loses his job behind that, okay? Now, he then goes and vows to have vengeance on everybody he thought had a role in him losing his job. What does he do? He goes on and kills some cops, okay? Then there's this big manhunt. This happened so long ago. Yes, 2013. I know, 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago. Mr. Dorner loses his life in a cabin in Big Bear where over 400 cops showed up to capture this one man. And no, he did not come out alive. So please miss me with the "you don't understand violence" as a response. Because when somebody killed a cop, the cops showed up 400 strong to attack one guy. So when you see people who are angry, when you see people who are violent, when you see people who watched a man have his hands in his pocket with his knee on another guy's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there are people who are upset. There are people who are angry. There are people who want to lash out. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody, and they were talking about how blue lives matter. Well, I'm not saying that blue lives don't matter. I'm also going to say that blue lives don't exist because you chose to be a cop. Being blue is a choice. Being black is how I was born. I had no say-so in that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we can come back and go in circles too, but I think that was going back to like the police defunding stuff, that the confusion around that, because I think when you hear that, you automatically think, wait, we want to get rid of the police? Like, why would we do that? But then I challenge all of you, wherever you live, to go and look at the budgets that are going to police. And it's not necessarily the police or any individual cop, it's the system, right? It's the system that where in the United States, we train cops for 18 weeks or something. And then in Norway, which has a much higher crime rate, they train their cops for 3 years. There's a lot, and then there's also the point about guns and how prevalent guns are, and how if you are a cop in the United States, you have to be prepared to meet someone with a gun because of our right to bear arms. And I think that is also another really interesting piece of that. And it's not necessarily calling to get rid of police, but it's let's reform what's going on right now, because things aren't working. And maybe some of you saw the message from the New York, I think it was the police chief, who was angrily, just being really venting about, and rightfully so. I'm sure that I can't imagine what it's been like for him, but it's something that a lot of people are saying, well, this is what people of color experience all the time. This kind of, not racism, but this criticism and this these stereotypes, and and then you look in the background and it's all white men, and you wonder, like, what is this? Again, messaging, symbolism, all that, really, really huge. And I just think it takes so much courage to talk about these things and to like question why are things the way they are. And Gibbs, I didn't want to pass up, I don't know if you'd be comfortable sharing the story of one of your players who had the Confederate flags at a rally, right? And
I'm gonna, before you do, Gibbs, sorry, I'm just gonna interrupt to say that I'm gonna switch the chat to open to everybody, and if you have a question, send to me privately, do that. But people are saying really good stuff on the chat, and I want everyone to see that. Okay?
Yes.
So go ahead.
Let's do it.
Sorry, Gibbs, go.
That's okay. I just wanted to add to like what you were saying about the NFL, like receiving a check from the Department of Defense. It's like, especially as a white person in particular, like for a long time, I feel personally like I lived in kind of a state of ignorant bliss, right? Like I'm wearing a veil basically of, you know, I'm safe in my house. I don't have these issues. I listen to what my dad says and like the information he gets off of Fox News. Like my grandparents live and die by Fox News, right? And it's on us to not be so naive as to just believe what you hear. And you know, that face value. And the problem with social media right now is like you just have this quick access at your fingertips and very little patience to look into anything that's longer than 30 seconds long, right? So you know, and especially being in the community that we're in at Linfield, like we do have the advantage to be able to challenge these things, challenge what you're hearing, challenge what you're seeing. I didn't even know that about the NFL. I think that's kind of wild, but that's one of so many situations that we come up against where, you know, if like me, I was like, oh yeah, of course we're gonna do the national anthem before the game because that's just what we do, because this is our country and we support our country. But once you start to dig a little deeper behind things and like really start to figure out what does defunding the police mean, not just taking those two words for what you heard and creating your own story in your head, right? It's like doing a little bit of research and figuring out what alternatives are and starting to really challenge the system and not just listen to the 1 minute headlines, if that makes sense. But
absolutely. Yeah. It makes you wonder too, like there was a big, this was a couple of years ago when they were questioning prayer before games. And just like, you know, it's just these things we take for granted, I think, with the anthem, with prayer. And it's like, well, not all people may be of that faith and or believe in that kind of display of faith. And it's just so, it's these things that become so embedded in our head.
It doesn't make it wrong. Yeah. It doesn't make it wrong either way, whether you believe or you don't believe, but it's just like, what kind of environment are we creating for inclusivity, right? Like that's the ultimate goal. And, you know, to confine it to one entity takes out everything else and keeps everyone safe in this little bubble.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And while we're kind of on the symbolism piece, the statues started, and so I also agree with John. I'm not a proponent for violent protests. I'm a big fan of. I did a history project on Martin Luther King when I was in 5th grade, and I can only imagine, because I think that certain people even in the Native community held those prejudice against African American people. So I can only imagine what that was like when I did that in the 5th grade, and I had a big poster board of Martin Luther King Jr. And it was one of the best things I've ever did, though. And I'm a true believer in what he promotes and like nonviolent protest. And while I don't necessarily support the defacing of public property, I do think that there are some good reasoning behind taking down statues and these relics of a really uncomfortable past. With Christopher Columbus, I view Christopher Columbus right there with Hitler. He landed in what would be the United States, and committed genocide, and not only took slaves, but just destroyed the lives of an entire society. And growing up on my little reservation, I didn't realize like my people were all over the South. Like we were, before the South was the South, and before the United States was the United States. And we weren't on the reservations by choice. That was a forced thing. And so for us, someone like Christopher Columbus symbolizes that. I had a really great statement from one of the Onondaga leaders in that I put it on the PowerPoint for her, because the president, or I think it's the governor of New York, who spoke about the removal of the Columbus statue, not supporting of that. And she comes back and talks about how offensive and how just just insensitive that is to indigenous peoples, not just in the United States, but around the world. It's, I've never celebrated Columbus Day. It's not a thing to me, because he didn't discover America. There were people here long before he came. And so I think it was one more back, Jane. Yeah, so this was a statement by Betty Lyons. You know, as Americans embrace the movement to remove the Confederate flag, those who ignore Christopher Columbus's role, giving the green light to centuries of racism and dehumanizing indigenous peoples. And again, I don't want to take away from what Black Lives Matter is doing, and the inequalities and the systemic things that have happened to the African American in this country, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention this thing. It's the same stuff, right? History repeats itself. If you don't learn your history, it's gonna repeat itself. And I think this is the kind of time we're living in right now. I think, John.
Yeah.
I think dismantling concepts of white supremacy and concepts of that have been internalized in ourselves is beneficial to everyone, white people included. But if we're focused on Black Lives Matter right now, it's not to say that other populations and people of color are not equally as important and have also been compromised and marginalized. And so by looking at it, really, I feel like, and maybe this is because I'm white, but I feel like the bulk of the work is for white people like myself to start to really look at where we see systemic racism, and understanding that if we stay silent on it, if we don't question what we know, it's just going to stay the same. There's nothing that's going to change until we actually start to change the conversation. And I wanted to go to Mike for a second, Mike Blackmore, because you had a question you wanted to ask everybody. Are you there?
Yeah, this is kind of more for the coaches, and I think we've all experienced this at least once. And I've experienced it at Linfield already. Sometimes when we travel, we stay at hotels, and you know, the person behind the desk says, "Welcome, you know, have a great time, but maybe you shouldn't go out after dark." And whether that's because the hotel happens to be in a neighborhood where there's a Black community, or we're in a neighborhood where you know, there's just a lot of crime, and we have to be aware of our you know, our space when we're out doing things. I'm just curious how other coaches on this call react to that conversation and what we tell our athletes.
I'll jump in. Coach, it's good to hear your voice again. Speaking to that specific example, I personally don't think that crime has a color. So like, you could be like in a Black neighborhood or a white neighborhood or a Hispanic neighborhood or whatever kind of neighborhood. If the neighborhood is high crime rate, essentially, I personally don't think that it has to be a specific color, essentially. But
I agree with that, John.
Okay, cool. But I do think that us as coaches, when we're deciding where we're going to stay and where we're going to house our teams, essentially, I think we have to be diligent in our research about where we're staying, where we're going. But I love that question, Mike, because that speaks to like a larger point. And that is this. You have to look at it as an umbrella, like systematic racism, okay? Like at the top, and underneath that is social injustice, okay? And then underneath that is like Black Lives Matter, all right? And I'm saying that because my house is on fire right now because I'm a Black man, right? And we just watched a Black man die in police custody on video, okay? But that doesn't mean that there aren't fires in Nat's house, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's wrong for a lot of different people. That doesn't mean that Kibbs doesn't have a fire as a white woman, That doesn't mean that, you know, Doug doesn't have a fire going on. Like he mentioned yesterday how it was illegal to speak the native language. And you know, in American Samoa, like that's an issue. That's a problem. So I don't know, Mike, to speak to your example, I don't know if like the fact that you're being told, okay, don't go outside after dark, okay, it could be dangerous to go outside after dark. It very well could be, but the why in that messaging, the why are you even being, why are you being told that? And it's stuff like that that's told for centuries and years upon years upon years. It's this fear that's created. Again, if you have a chance, look up the Lynch Code by Willie Lynch, and you'll see that this tactic of fear that is created of certain people. Okay, well, like for example, calling Native Americans savages, right? Well, in actuality, who has the savage and more barbaric type behavior? It's not the Native Americans. It's not the Black people. Like, for example, we've seen a lot of criminals who are Black. There are a lot of Black people who break the law, right? Like, I can admit that, right? Have no problem with that. However, we haven't seen a Black man with his knee on a police officer's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds with his hands in his pockets. We haven't seen that. So I would say, you know, try to speak to your question, Mike, specifically, I would say try to, you know, look and scout out the area before you get there. And then if you are, as you are driving into the hotel, kind of just look around, you know, and if you don't feel like your team's going to be safe or comfortable in that area, then I wouldn't stay there. You know, I wouldn't, you know, and then I would have that conversation with the powers that be at the school, whether it's Gary or whomever. I call and say, hey, I don't think that this would be keeping the team in a safe spot. I mean, I think we all work together. That's one of the beautiful things I love about Linfield is the community at Linfield. So I'm sure that and I'm going to go out on a limb, but I'm sure that the powers that be at the college would not have a problem with you saying, hey, I felt as though my athletes were going to be in danger, so we chose to go stay somewhere else.
If I could add to that, you know, Mike, would that person ask the same questions if you're a coach of color? Would that person ask the same questions if you were someone that had a different stature?
I don't disagree
And
with
I
that
think
at
as a
all.
coach too, is a lot of times it's on your comfort zone. You know, I've been told the same thing, but I'm going to go out because it does. I'm not afraid to go out. You know, but if someone's warning you about, you know, the concern about that, I think that's always. I always would think, why are you telling me this? Or can you be more specific about what's going on? And John makes a good point. You be in an area where you are comfortable, where you're not going to be intimidated and safe for your students and your student athletes.
And it reflects on our society as a whole, right? We've all had our mom like say like, oh, that's a bad area of town. Or there's a joke about Martin Luther King Jr. Street being like the worst areas in most neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And it, you know, this idea of a place being unsafe or a bad neighborhood often ties back to, you know, redlining and all these procedures that were meant to disenfranchise people of color when our, you know, our suburbs and our cities were forming and growing. And so I think that's also really, I'd love to ask whoever, when people say that, I'd love to say, well, why have you thought about why this area of town isn't prosperous or isn't safe? And I think that's always something that I'd never thought about until more recently.
Well, and then I ask myself, so, you know, why is this person working at this hotel if they feel, you know, unsafe outside the front door?
Absolutely.
Great question. That's a great question, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah. If I was their boss, I wouldn't want them promoting that in our hotel for sure.
Yeah.
You know, in a lot of ways too, it kind of touches the subject of people being uncomfortable at times around people of color. You know, you see that at times when you're shopping or even walking on the street. You know, people don't make eye contact. They avoid you. You know, and this is a great story. I shared this with my family just the other night when I was at Lowe's, and you know, I had my mask, and big Latino guy walks by, and I look at him. I kind of smiled, kind of as best I could, and he smiled, went by. Then I got into my truck, loaded my items, and he drove by, and he gave me back a big smile. You know, I think a lot of times people are reluctant to smile, to say hi, how are you doing? They're intimidated, but it starts with the conversation, and the conversations could be a look, and it starts that way by sometimes asking. A lot of times I've been misinterpreted as far as my race, because a lot of people don't know. He's darker colored, he has a different accent. I'm not sure who he is, so they assume I'm Latino, I'm Mexican. You know, and there was a story when I was back in college. Jody Tyrell, he's actually Tokelau, Polynesian. We played football together here. His girlfriend lived in Amity, and we had asked her stepdad if needed help to work in the cherry orchards. He goes, yeah. So there was one weekend we were pruning trees. He showed us how to prune. We had our shirts off. We had long hair. We took our shirts off. It was really hot, and we put our shirts on our head. And then a neighbor guy walked out, and he started speaking Spanish to us. And none of us spoke Spanish. I had no idea, but I do remember today what he said. It was in mucho calor. So he looked at me, he goes, he's talking to you. I go, no, he's not, he's talking to you. I think he's talking to us. And we turned at him and says, what'd you say? And he went, oh, it's very hot today. And so all day we were pruning mucho calor, you know, but we didn't take offense. We just thought, he doesn't know. He thinks if you're dark skinned and you have a different accent that you must be Mexican, you know, so.
I wanted to bring up a side conversation I've been having on chat about police defunding, and I will apologize. I guess I kind of will apologize to the group. I was the one who was supposed to look more into police defunding, and honestly, it's been a really busy week. So I think it's a conversation that we can have more discussion around, but there are, you know, obviously there's the phrase defund the police is not totally upset, it's not kosher, basically, to use a Jewish term. It's really like, it's upsetting because it gives the illusion that the police are going to be completely defunded and defunct and we're going to go to anarchy, which is actually not what any city is proposing. However, it's not also clear how that money is going to be reallocated. And so there's a lot of concern behind that. There are a lot of questions about, well, what does that look like to move money away from police and into programs that are supporting the community as well? Are we making our neighborhoods less safe? Are we making them more safe because we're dismantling a systemically racist situation and putting funds somewhere else? So that's some discussion we can have if anyone wants to chime in on that.
Well, Jane, I noticed that some departments like Salem, they're making some cuts already, but I think there might be some confusion to why these cuts are taking place now. Is it because of COVID? Or now it's because of the movement, the things that are going on now? Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I lost my picture for somehow. But anyway, there's some confusion with that.
Yeah, I think there's also confusion around because it's difficult when you see these kinds of numbers because hardly anybody has ever seen a budget the size of a police force, right? Like we don't operate in a business world where we get to see budgets that are that big. So when you look at the Portland police budget where they want to drop, I think it was $5 million that they want to reallocate towards community funds. And when you look at the grand scheme of the whole budget, that is a sliver in the pie of money. And so but I think it's on us to really look at, if we don't understand this, it's important that we start asking questions, because it's really important that we obviously want to keep our neighborhoods safe. We don't want to reinforce the status quo if what has been happening in certain departments of the police have not been effective or have been furthering systemic racism. So it's important for us to look into that more and understand it. And all of us are in different communities too, so it's worth looking at in all of our different towns. Other thoughts on that? Anyone want to chime in?
A little bit more about just like protesting and like why, and the difference between like protesting and riots. And, you know, I think something to remember too is the reason people protest is not to come together over something that, you know, we all have an agreeable discussion, and you know, it's meant to ruffle feathers, right? It's meant to kind of like stir up the issue at hand and create change. So, you know, it is important to have protests. Now, looting, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your cause kind of gets lost in once you go around to do that, right? Like that doesn't have provide any purpose. But, you know, I think protesting offers something much different. That is purposeful and not everyone's going to agree with, but it is meant to spark change.
Something I've heard over and over again too is that like now what people are seeing at protests and things like that is just a bigger variety of people and different colors of people. And I'm a big fan of Alexandria Ocasio, and she had a great response when someone asked, what does America with the funded police look like? And she said, the good news is that it actually doesn't take a ton of imagination. It looks like a suburb. And these communities already have lower crime rates, not because they have more police, but they have more resources to support healthy society. You know, they find community service or rehab, their other investments. And another conversation I think too around this is what the kind of the policing of the police, and how there was, I highly recommend the John Oliver episode most recently about how they have this immunity that they can't be kind of terminated from their jobs. And so making sure that you're not having people that are invested in the police force kind of protecting in the police force, where it's a kind of a checks and balances, which I think we can all agree with in sports is something that we look to. Tanya brought up thoughts about boycotts of companies and statements. And I just talked with one of my really good friends last night, who she's at the University of Alabama, and she's really frustrated. She works in their athlete development, and she's really frustrated because their athletics department hasn't come out and had like an official statement. They haven't had any action. And she said she feels that they're afraid to misspeak. They're so afraid to do something wrong that they're not doing anything at all. And she feels really hopeless. And I felt bad because I was bragging about like, oh, we put together this conversation we had last week, and we were able to have this open dialogue, and she's just not able to do that. And I think that it's a delicate balance between you have to be true. You can't, so many of the corporate statements you can tell are just, not trying to lose that audience and trying to I don't know if you would, I saw another statement that said, if this isn't in your mission statement, then I don't want to see a statement at all. Like it needs to be incorporated in your mission if you're not about that. But yeah, I think there's a lot, especially on the sports side of sports teams and what they tried to say. And even the Washington professional football team tried to do the Blackout Tuesday. And if you don't know what the term Redskins refers to, look it up. It's not respectful, and it's not promoting equity or an equal society. So I think it's a really fine line that a lot of these companies and teams are really having to walk. It's
well, and if you think about
nightmare.
with Alabama not producing a statement, it's like Alabama was at one point the capital of the Confederate, right? So Montgomery, Alabama was the original capital. So you have that entire just like history, ancestors, heritage, everyone, people are afraid to speak out because that's all they've known, and have received backlash for thinking differently in that term. So, you know, again, it's like, just like knowing the history, where it's coming from. Why are people thinking like this? Why wouldn't they support that? Why do they support this versus that? You know, and like having that understanding. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying, you know,
No, yeah.
just having that perspective of why wouldn't they put out a statement? They have one of the most successful football teams, you know, University of Alabama, Roll Tide. It's disgusting, but I'm a Wildcat through and through. But
I'm sorry. I back on the policing experience. My son played in Germany about 5-6 years ago, and it was new for me and never been out of the United States. And I asked my son, I noticed the police, they don't carry guns. And then as we're crossing the crosswalk, I got away from the crosswalk and my son says, Dad, you got to stay in the crosswalk. Because if you don't stay in the crosswalk, the people are going to yell at you. Because in Germany, all the people follow the rules. And of course, I drove, and in Germany, it tells you when you can make an illegal turn versus in the United States, they tell you when you can't make a turn. So I made a turn assuming that in Germany, they're saying you couldn't or could, but anyway, I made a legal turn and I got honked at and people were yelling at you. And so I asked my son Moorhead, because he's already been in Germany and studied the, you know, the behavior of things that are going on. And I said, Dad, why don't, Aaron, how come police officers don't carry guns? He goes, they don't need to. Only the military can carry guns. The crime rates in Germany are really low. So I'm always intrigued by how can Germany and perhaps other countries can maintain and police without the nonviolence. Not saying there isn't any, and I don't know as much, but I was observing all that at the short time I was in Germany. Just really interesting.
I've got a good question here about how to stay educated and how to continue our education as individuals as we learn more about this, and also how to decipher through the noise. And this is something Lindsay has talked about, especially in just that the way, first of all, the way social media is set up, it's not intended for you to pause and reflect. It doesn't feed you information in a way that's possibly absorbable if you continue at the pace that social media and looking at social media sets. So one of the first things to do is just to put aside social media and start to dig into resources that are a little bit more permanent. So looking at talking with people in your community. John has talked about this before, and he's a history teacher, so or he was a history teacher, so I love picking his brain on stuff. But talking to people in your community and looking for resources that are written, that are cited, that are academic in nature, and not just the most recent news one. And I think all of us know that from working in academia, but basically just trying to use your critical thinking skills that you get from a liberal arts education and try to decipher, okay, what's the source on this and where can I go further? And I think in my experience, once you pull the thread, more comes quickly. You just start finding more and more and more resources of this author wrote about this book too, or did a preface in this book, and that led me to this, and that led me to that, and these movies over here. And so I think just starting to tug on the string is helpful. I will say two things about that too. One is we're gonna share a resource guide that Natalie really put a bunch of information into. It's excellent. And secondly, a book that I've read recently, and maybe everybody wants to, we can sort of wrap
Book
up
club.
recently. One of the books that I read recently, I don't know if anyone's read this, is The Warmth of Other Suns. Has anyone read that? It's fantastic. It's about the Great Migration out of the South, the 6 million Blacks who left the South over the course of 70 years between 1910 and 1980. And it's absolutely brilliant. It shows a lot of where Black communities ended up setting up based on the train lines from major cities in the South to where their main outlet was in the North or in the West. And so we're looking at Detroit, Chicago, Oakland, LA, and why those communities landed there, and then what they experienced once they landed there. And so anyway, sharing books like that or sharing titles that have had an impact on you, I think is really helpful too, and just within our community to keep sharing those kinds of things. Any other thoughts on, anyone else want to share a book they've read that was powerful or experience that was powerful?
Yeah, a book called Black Like Me. and it was a white person who ends up changing pigmentation so that it's darker, so that he would actually really experience. And he was, let's just say it was an eye-opening experience for him.
I'm not very far into it. Hi, everyone. I'm Lainey. But I just started reading So You Want to Talk About Race. I cannot remember, and I don't know where my book is. I've been walking around the house with it, but I don't remember the author's name, but I could look it up. But it is very easy to read. It's very digestible. It has a lot of really good talking points. If you're talking to someone, Natalie, I'm a fellow North Carolinian. If you're talking to people who have not thought about these things before, or who are not necessarily willing to think about these things before, she just does a really great job. So that one, I have the library's copy, unfortunately, right now. So you can't get it from the Nicholson Library, but it's really good, and I really recommend it.
She was just interviewed on Livewire too. They just played that episode again last weekend, so you can find that interview. Now, I can't remember her name either, but it was good.
I put the link in the chat, I think, for that book. You want to talk about race?
Awesome.
I'm
I'm a big fan of podcasts and Vox Media, which is definitely a more left-leaning. But see, my thing is like, just like we kind of know Vox is, right-leaning, you just knowing where things are or how they kind of stand. But Vox has a podcast called Today Explained, and it's kind of a daily kind of just a news, and they recently had the episode about defunding the police. That was really great, but very much current topics, and I feel like I learn something every day I listen to that. I love Tanya's suggestion of Ibram Kendi's books. He's coming out with a children's book next, which is really exciting. His book, How to Be Anti-Racist, is awesome, and highly recommend that too. And we and Doug were talking about this just the other day, about like the power of stories. And it's hard, I think, like Jane said, with social media, everything's so now, but I think the stories are what really persist. And my people didn't write down anything, but they told stories. Oral storytelling was the way they kept their heritage going. And I think that's what makes sports so great, is the stories in sport. And so I definitely love the recommendations, and yeah, be on the lookout for that source list, because we had a lot of great stuff.
I think too, like, because we are on social media, like, you can use it to your advantage too. Like, if you're following, and like right now, especially in the media and in politics, you're going to hear the most extreme forms of each side. And it's your responsibility and up to you to like listen to both sides and maybe form your own opinion based on the information that you've gathered. But if you're going to follow one idea, one opinion, you should probably also follow someone that thinks the complete opposite. And that way you're kind of getting the different perspectives and being able to like that's another way to educate yourself, is to hear both sides, and just consider who you're surrounding yourself with and who you are, what you're putting in your own face every day when you're scrolling through, and like making sure that you are figuring out what both sides say. And I'm sure there's truth in both, and there's also lies on both sides. So just trying to be responsible to figuring, doing your research and figuring it out.
So I just shared, oops, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, don't be afraid to ask questions or to set up to talk to people. John just asked, Doug, I'd love to learn more about Hawaiian culture, and you got a book to read, just get some coffee. Absolutely. I'll share as much as I know, and maybe give you some other leads to where you can get more information, because I don't know all the answers, and I think it's strong, and it strengthens your knowledge to get more than one resource. I think the more information you can get. And the younger generation, is so much easier for you guys now. The older generation is a little bit harder for us back when. We had to ask your parents or teachers, coaches, or you had to go to the library. I had to catch the bus to the library. But anyway, now the information is in your hands. but I think it's also important to talk to people. Like me, I get a lot of my information from my son. I mean, because he's kind of been an expert in some of the topics that we're talking about. And so I ask him questions, you know, so I think it's important to talk to people and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And I just shared, I think that sometimes, looking locally, whether you're talking about defund police, looking at your local police is really important versus just looking at that monolithic movement in the ways that people have described. But something that's been weighing on me, and it definitely is not athletic related, but it's Linfield related, and it relates to performative allyship and the way that social media currently is used. So I did share the Oregonian link. I don't know if others have seen it as well. Domain Serene, which the Evans, our wine studies program was basically started by those folks, are major Trump donors, and they were getting a lot of pushback about what many would argue is a performative allyship, posting a generic, we stand by, and against racism, and people really pushed back. And I think to some degree, out of that came this most current donation that's meant to provide scholarships to diversify the field. And so I honestly am struggling a lot, particularly given the ways that we've been talking about that racism is baked into our culture, right? Our economic and political culture. Is to what degree are you a purist and say, you can't, you're just covering your ass, it's just performative allyship, or to what degree do you actually sort of disregard intention and say, hey, this is an opportunity, and how do we make use of that in a way that we maybe diversify a committee of people who choose these scholarships, and or do we reach out and actually have these courageous conversations with donors in ways where we actually kind of hold their feet to the fire a bit in terms of, you're in the wine industry. We know that you rely on immigrants to pick your grapes. And, to what degree does your support of this political candidate maybe go against, against this population that you're making a lot of money on? So I know it's not athletic related, but it seems really intimately tied in with a lot of these issues we've been talking about. And I think it's important to have these really difficult conversations.
I agree. And the worst thing we can do is stop talking. That's the worst thing we can do right now, because there's so much momentum behind this. And I know that there's, I mean, first of all, the only way we're going to learn more is to keep talking with each other, but also there is so much momentum here. And I think one of the things I've struggled with in the past couple of days, especially, is that, as I said earlier, it's, you got to turn off social media, you got to turn off information at times, but I don't want this to go away. I want the conversations to continue. I don't want to see the news trend move on to something else. I want them to stay on this. I want to keep focused on this, because if we can keep it in conversation, we can make some change. And what you're bringing up, Tanya, is a really good point, that this is it. I mean, we look at the same thing in athletics of, like, we have to run athletics programs, we need so many different constituents, and we need to make sure each of them are invested in what we're doing and feel some ownership in what we're doing. So we cannot afford to alienate anyone, but we also need to help move the conversation forward. And that it's just challenging. So looking at the wine studies program that's a great example too, of, like, we need to really recognize that a community is a partnership with everyone. And so there needs to be a dialogue with everyone, and not to say, well, you don't agree with me, so therefore we're just going to shut you out. We can't work with you. It's tricky. It takes a lot of careful wording.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, Tanya, because I think it gets back to, like, what it's, so we talk about race and, even, gender, but it's all about, like, money and power. Like, and you can make a statement as a corporation, but show me your executive board, show me your leadership, or and I would challenge the Domain Serene to say, okay, you can create a scholarship, but are you going to create a pathway for people of color to be equally represented in your leadership? And how does that, and I have a hard time when people say, well, that was my personal money, and it's really tough, because it's money is power. And I think we have to definitely be careful with that relationship and how that transpires. And it's like kind of the model token minority thing. You don't ever want to be kind of a part of that. You want to actually be a part of a greater structural change, and how that aligns with the politics too. It's just it's exhausting.
It is. So now it's been an hour and a half, and that's what we committed our time to today. This is obviously a conversation that could go on and on and on, and there's plenty to talk about always. So yeah, Natalie, any wrap up, or John or Lindsay or Doug, anything else you want to throw out there aside from, I will say thank you everyone for being here and contributing, and we'll make this recording available, and the recording will show the chat, so we'll be able to see all these links too. But thank you everyone. I
don't know about everyone else, but this is very therapeutic and very healing for me. And it's just good to see everyone's faces and their participation. And I encourage you to look up Juneteenth and coming up next week. Look around the history of that and what's going on there.
John shaking his head.
I am. I just think that's incredible that President Trump would even choose to have a rally there in that location on that particular day. It's just insulting. That's Preston, who is awake from his nap now.
Also disagrees.
Yes, he does. So I don't want to slant anybody. I would just tell you to do your own homework, do your own research on it. But I appreciate you guys tuning in and having a conversation. So anything I can do to help anybody, if you have any questions that I may be able to answer, or I'd love to hear your story, your perspective also. So my door is open.
Same here. I've had some players reach out already and other coaches, and we're here to help any way we can. We can share and tell our story. I think it's like I shared with our group that it's important to tell the story, let people hear your story. And then, it just reminds me that I remind my kids on a daily basis, be positive, be kind, and be grateful. So again, I'm grateful to be part of this.
Yep, I'm grateful. I think, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's going to just take a lot of, questioning and opening yourself up, and we're all here to talk if it's ever needed. And I think I would just encourage you to question everything and do your homework.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Have a fantastic weekend, and hope to talk to you.
John, look at that beautiful baby.
Oh, he's so cute.
Do that on purpose.
Yeah.
The grandpa in me needs to see that.